with respect to today's activities is that the keynote was given by Nandan, and this is where I discovered 2 years ago the acronym which has now invaded my life, namely DPI. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Suman, because he can give you the perspective of this in the context of India's presidency.
So, as many of you know, the G20 was born in crisis at the time of the global financial crisis, as a device to try and convey a sense of global solidarity when it seemed as though the global financial system was going to go down in flames. It took place, its creation was at a very nervous time, not unlike today, in the transition from W to Obama, because this was happening on W's watch. Obama wasn't quite sure that he wanted to be associated with what was going on under W and Paulson, but there had already been a G20 at the level of finance ministers, which I think Paul Martin and Larry Summers put together a decade earlier. And again, I don't want to go back into prehistory, but because the resonances with this global moment are relevant, I'm going to do that. So as you know, Nixon took the US off Bretton Woods in '71 in response to the oil shock. Indeed, the war in Israel, the 7-day war, at about that time as well. And what started to happen soon after is that the big boys, originally the G5 and then the G7, started to basically say, we know we have an architecture of global institutions, the fund, the bank, etc. But, we're not going to be disciplined by them. We want to meet first at the finance minister level, and then at the leader level. And the G5 started, I think, a little bit later, and some of you may know that, after, for a brief period, the G7 became the G8. So the G7 was major Atlantic economies. Then, at the time of the Asian financial crisis, Paul Martin and Larry Summers realized that the emergence of India, China, etc., who were non-entities in '75, meant that you couldn't have concerted cooperative action without an expansion of the group. And so the finance ministers started to meet as a G20. And indeed, when I was at NCR, I hosted a meeting when India chaired the finance ministers at the Moria. I forget which year it was, but it was my time there. And then that structure was in place when the global financial crisis hit, and the finance minister structure was elevated to the leader's structure. I do want to just note that while you might have imagined, and this is relevant to where we are today, you might have imagined that bringing the G20 into existence was a reason for the G7 to go out of business, but it didn't. It continued, and we've had, this, I think, significant interplay, tension, call it what you will, between the G20 and the G7 in, 2008, the 18 years that the G20 has been in existence. Fast forward to what I was saying earlier, I had a moment in Europe, we're working for a think tank there, and I was asked to do some thinking and writing as somebody who was not from a G7 country on the 10th anniversary of the G20, which was in Buenos Aires. Okay, then it became India's turn to lead the G20, and I surprisingly found myself in the position of Vice Chairman NITI Aayog. And some of you may know that India's first Sherpa to the G20 in its early days was a predecessor of mine in a former role, Monte Ahluwalia. He played the role of G20 Sherpa for a while. And I had continued to write on what kind of a creature the G20 was while I was at Brookings in this 10-year review, which I guess would have been 2017. And so when India got the G20 presidency, and when Prime Minister Modi, I do have to say, chose to treat it as, if you like, India's coming out party, successfully, NITI Aayog felt that it should its bit. And that's what, when I reached out first to Kapil and said, look, we want to do this, but if it's G20, it should be wider than just India. We would need budget to get people from academics from G20 countries to be part of this discussion. And he said, you're not giving me a lot of time, I have to do board meetings, etc. But anyway, he cobbled together, he mobilized his board. Fortunately, relations with Canada at that time were reasonable, brought GDN on board, and so we were able, in fairly short order, to pull this document together. Now, I was flipping through, what I had said in the foreword at the time, and I do think it's worth repeating some of this. The G20 leaders' most basic commitment is to deliver strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth to be achieved through political guidance, arrived at through dialogue and policy coordination. And the relevance of that is actually that the G20 has no external legitimacy. It is not a treaty-based institution, unlike the fund, the bank, the WTO, etc. And so its legitimacy depends on its being able to come up with a political consensus, which then the leaders are committed to. And we already knew that because of COVID, that the, if you will, the emblem of global cooperation, the Sustainable Development Goals, were already in trouble at that time. And we also knew that after COVID, war in Europe was going to make matters quite complicated. We had invited Amitabh Kant to be here today. He sends his apologies, but Amitabh was the person who allowed us to use the G20 logo on this. But more importantly, he was, I think, and I think others would agree, an important player in a sequence of at least 3, if not 4, successive G20 presidencies, starting with Indonesia, then India, then Brazil, and now coming up in South Africa. All of this taking place against the background of first the war in Ukraine, and, well, actually even before that, the tensions between India and China on our border. And so it was an achievement of some magnitude that I think I'm right in saying that all 3 of the 4 emerging market presidencies succeeded in having a consensus declaration
coming out of the leaders process, including our own. Okay, so that's the political background, and I think the relevance of that at this moment, which we, Jean-Louis and Kapil may want to embroider on, and we can have a discussion, is that if anything, things are more complicated now because of the change in the US administration, the signals that are coming out in terms of presence at the G20 meetings in South Africa of the foreign ministers. But I think what remains relevant is the discussion that we were able to have on a new development model that the world needed to reach for at the time of India's G20 presidency. And since my other hat is as the representative, since NITI Aayog is the nodal institution for the SDGs, the progress on Agenda 2030 and the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals was something that India, I think, pulled out of the shadows and really made central as an instrument of, as a symbol of global cooperation. I've spoken much longer than I probably should have, but to me, symbolically, it was important. Substantively, we only gave speakers 12 minutes each. I think we got a surprising amount of content from people on the key issues of development. And then I think I leave it to Jean-Louis to, if he has not done so already, to provide us with a global perspective of how, in a sense, what you've been discussing all day, to some extent, takes forward India's aspirations through its G20 presidency as reflected in the book. So you were very generous, Jean-Louis, in not cutting me off. Let me hand back to you and, as chair.
Right. Hand to Kapil.
Good, Kapil.
Do you mind if I use the podium? I've got some prepared remarks. Right?
Sure.
Hi, thanks very much. Is this working? Thank you. I did prepare a set of remarks, but happy to discuss after that. But first of all, let me just say on behalf of IDRC that it's a great honor to be with you here today for the launch of this book, which has been a baby in production now since the middle of 2023. I think the point I want to make is that in recent years, as Suman alluded, the G20 has gone through a quiet transformation, one that is reshaping how we think about global development. The transformation has been led not by the global north, as has traditionally been the case, but by the rising voices of the global south, through the G20 presidencies of Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa. These 4 consecutive Southern-led presidencies, I think, more than managed an agenda, I think they reimagined it. Each of these countries brought something very powerful and unique to the table: a shared commitment to inclusion, to equity and sustainable development, and a clear message that development cannot be an afterthought. In global governance, it must be central. Indonesia, leading the in the wake of the global COVID-19 pandemic, emphasized that global health resilience, digital transformation, and sustainable energy are all centrally important to our planet. Jakarta's leadership reminded us that in a deeply connected world, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Then came India, whose presidency was a landmark moment, with the powerful motto, "One Earth, one family, one future." India brought global attention back to the core values of solidarity and shared responsibility. India expanded the G20's outreach, giving the Global South a much-needed seat at the table through the historic inclusion of the Africa Union as a permanent member. It focused on climate action, digital public infrastructure, gender equity, and the urgent reform of multilateral development banks. India's leadership showed that development is not charity, it is a partnership grounded in mutual respect. Brazil continued this momentum, shining the spotlight on fighting inequality, eradicating hunger, and promoting sustainable development. It brought to the forefront the idea that economic growth without social justice is not development, it's imbalance. And as the current G20 chair, South Africa's presidency focuses on inclusive growth, just energy transitions, and reforming global financial governance, priorities that reflect not only Africa's realities, but those of many developing nations. South Africa is chairing or championing a global development agenda that asks hard but necessary questions. Why do so many countries remain trapped in debt cycles? Why is climate finance still out of reach for those most affected by climate change? And how do we ensure that technology and innovation truly serve the many and not the few? Together, these Southern-led presidencies have moved the G20 beyond being just a crisis response forum to becoming a platform for development challenge and development dialogue, one that listens more, includes more, and delivers more for those historically left behind. We live today, as was mentioned, in a world that is more divided geopolitically, more strained economically, and more fragile environmentally than ever before. In this context, the G20 has become not just relevant, it has become essential. And now, as the presidency transitions to the United States, I feel there is a vital opportunity, not just to lead, but to listen, to learn, and to lift the priorities that these 4 Southern-led presidencies have placed on the table. So what can the US take forward? First, inclusivity. As India showed, the strength of the G20 lies in diversity. The US can continue to make space for emerging voices from Africa, from Latin America, and the Pacific to co-author the solutions we need. Second, partnership-driven development. Development must be co-created, not imposed. This means supporting efforts to reform global financial institutions so that they can work for everyone and not just the few. Third, technology for good. The US can champion the principles of open, inclusive, and secure digital public infrastructure, building on India's remarkable successes in digital identity, payments, and public service delivery. And finally, climate justice. Southern-led presidencies have called for climate action that is fair, affordable, and supports sustainable transitions in developing countries. The US can and should align climate ambition with climate equity. So in closing, let's just remember, the G20 is not just a gathering of the world's largest economies. It is a circle of shared responsibility. The baton may now pass to Washington, but the spirit of inclusive, people-centered leadership shown by Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa must continue to guide our path. The Global South has shown us, through its leadership, that when development is driven by empathy, inclusion, and partnership, it becomes not just possible, but transformative. Because the future of development is not about charity, it is about justice. It is not about power, it is about partnership. It is not about waiting, it is about us acting together now. The book we launched today captures the richness of these insights, and I very strongly encourage you to leaf through it. And as was mentioned, it is open access. This volume stands both as a resource and as a roadmap for policymakers, researchers, and development partners committed to a future of sustainable, inclusive growth. Let me close by reaffirming IDRC's commitment to working with partners across the Global South to invest in knowledge, advance inclusive innovation, and deepen collective action, because only together can we navigate today's challenges and unlock the opportunities of tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Let me just say a couple of things making the link between the book. You'll notice the title, Navigating Challenges for Sustainable Growth. Personally, I just prefer growth, because if it's not sustainable, why should we actually want growth if it weren't sustainable? But let's put a macro hat on. I know I was poo-pooing macro people, given that I'm mainly a micro person. But let's put a macro hat on for a second and think in terms of growth accounting, and think in terms of what the underlying model is, and how digitalization more broadly, and how DPI in particular fits into growth. So, not everyone in the room is an economist. There's some technologists as well, but let me use some econo speak here. If we think of this in a growth accounting perspective, and you think of a production function. Okay? So we've got a bunch of factor inputs. Digitalization, is it something which affects total factor productivity? Or is it something which affects the productivity of single factors of production? Okay? So is it something like which is labor augmenting? Is it capital augmenting? Or is it TFP, total factor productivity? And you can see that this is sort of entering the growth discourse, digital, all things digital, because even as conservative an institution as the World Bank has created a digital vice presidency. Okay? And that tells you something when the World Bank sets up a digital vice presidency, and they have a very, very, very smart digital vice president at the bank. Now, as you probably know, there are a whole bunch of different growth models, right? So you'll remember this from your student days. You've got exogenous growth models, you've got endogenous growth models, right? So if you have sort of Deus Ex Machina stuff, Solo, Ramsey, etc., okay, where you have constant returns, and then you have endogenous growth models. Where does DPI fit in? And where does India fit in terms of DPI, in terms of digitalization, but in terms of DPI, in terms of that growth model? So let me just sort of continue with that taxonomy, and then I'll shut up. So it's certainly not exogenous. Okay, certainly not exogenous. It's certainly endogenous. I don't think it's Romer. Okay, so that's one. That's endogenous technological change. I somehow don't think it's Romer. I don't think that's the way we should be looking at it. But feel free to disagree. I don't think it's creative destructions. I don't. Pache to my another guy I was a TA for, Philippe Aguillon. So Aguillon-Howitt type models of Schumpeterian growth with creative destruction. I don't think it's Lucas. Okay, so Lucas making a miracle, right, where you have an externality in terms of learning or doing, and you have an externality, an educational externality from one generation to the next. What I think it is, I think it's Grossman-Helpman. I think it's Grossman-Helpman, and I think that we could characterize India's role in this, or the role that it aspires to have as a leader in terms of DPI in international growth, is basically Grossman-Helpman, where in this case, India is the leader and other countries in the global south are the followers. And there's basically a transmission of these new varieties of goods or new varieties of factor inputs from India to the rest of the global south. And that's Grossman-Helpman leader-follower model, and in this case, India is the leader. Those are my thoughts on trying to link this to the growth literature.
Okay, do you want to open this up, or have this as a discussion between us?
As you wish. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you're the chair.
No, go ahead.
Okay,
Again, I spoke too much at length, and people need to be rewarded for their patience in being in the room. But something I omitted to say, I was so focused on the G20, is, as it were, the importance of GDN, or my own association with GDN, because some of you may know that GDN originated in the World Bank in my time there as an initiative led by somebody who was my contemporary, Lynn Squire, and then it was incubated in the World Bank, and then the decision was taken, I think with some foundation support, to make it independent, because the idea was a consortium for research in developing countries, and a very important person in that transition was the late and revered Ishwar Ahluwalia, who took a lot of interest in GDN. And Jean-Louis may have mentioned this, I'm sure he did, but let me just say that one reason why, with my present hat on, having an association with GDN is that GDN is a knowledge multinational that happens to be headquartered in India, and we don't have too many of them. I guess the impact evaluation one is the other one that we have. And so, just to say, I'm not quite sure when GDN set up here, but GDN's the evolution of India as a knowledge center is concurrent with GDN's own growth and flourishing. So, just wanted to make that point that I at NCR was supported by IDRC in the think tank initiative, but the association with GDN is also something that I wanted to do. Now, just on your formulations, in fact, I was a student longer ago than you, and so I may not have caught all those references. But look, I mean, I think there's the world before artificial intelligence, and then there's the world we are entering now. Pile's brother escorted me around, Princeton. He's a respected, I think, AI scientist there, or he's in the engineering school anyway, and was lamenting the fact that India was falling behind on leading edge research in AI. But that's not really what's relevant to a comment on your formulation. Then I'll hand over to Kapil. So, as you know, Acemoglu in particular has been arguing that we are all in danger of being taken in by the PR of the technological innovation. And again, I think the question is, the analytic question, the research question, and then the policy question is, if it is the case that these technologies are arising in an environment where relative factor prices are very different from the factor endowments that we have here, that they are innately, if you like, capital augmenting, labor saving, what does that then imply for policy and absorption? And in a world where, in a sense, your attitude towards platforms is now becoming a test of loyalty and is going to be thrown into trade discussions, etc., what research basis do countries of the South need to argue that, in the way the EU has been arguing, but it's on slightly different, on very different grounds, that look, no, not only on issues of privacy, that there are, as it were, development dimensions of the path we go down on. So I guess my short response to your formulation here would be to say that this was fine in the Silicon Age. Is that enough of a guide to AI? I'm not sure. Any response?
I mean, the only thing I'll add is I came towards the end of the session that you were chairing, and you talked about the two constraints, data and financing. I can't do much about the data part of it, but maybe I can address the issues related to financing. I mean, as you know, IDRC has been operating in the research space for the last 50 years. In Asia itself, we provided over $500 million to research across 33 countries in Asia. And increasingly right now, we are focusing on precisely this question about the future of AI. How can we use applications of AI that would make sense? What is the research question that needs to be addressed? How do you build on the leadership that India has demonstrated as part of the DPI? So there is a possibility of us finding the financing to address some of these research questions, provided the questions are posed in such a way that it presents itself as linking solidly to policy. Because increasingly for us, the link between research and policy is very, very important. We only like to finance institutions in the global south. We've had a long partnership with GDN. We've had a long partnership with many researchers sitting over here. And so I would just strongly encourage you to come up with a proposal, and I can promise to take it up and see if we can't.
Shall we open it up to the room? Comments, questions?
Thank you for your background and for laying out the backdrop against which this discussion is happening. I think there is a very interesting line that connects the SDGs, the DPIs, and AI, and a lot of the policy changes and shifts that are being contemplated. And I think there is really a huge opportunity for India to move the conversation from just DPIs to actually changing the game in critical areas of SDGs, namely healthcare, education, skilling, agriculture, and jobs as well. And all of this is possible because the new technologies, digital technologies, and the DPI framework enables us to create frameworks in which healthcare, education, etc. can be delivered to people at a very high quality, at a very low cost, in their language, at their homes. And this has been talked about by a number of entrepreneurs and innovators, both technology and venture capitalists. And the belief is that these models can actually evolve in developing countries like India rather than in the developed world because of the nature of the problems. And also the fact that in those countries, they already have fairly mature systems which will need to be disrupted and which have embedded interests which make it much more difficult. But given the gaps in the developing world, in the global south and in India in particular, and the fact that in addition to having those weaknesses, we have a tremendous strength in technology. It's a very curious combination, and it comes at precisely the time when technological innovation has enabled all these things. I think we need to figure out a way to put these together and then see if we can actually make it happen. And I think that's an area where, especially given the Dr. Bery's presence here, the NITI Aayog could actually trigger a discussion on how that can happen, what we need to do to make it happen, and what are the changes. Because this is not easy. There is a line, as I said, I believe so, but it's not easy because it requires action on the technology front, it requires action on the policy front, it requires action on the whole market in that area. And I think navigating that is not going to be easy. But I do believe that we have a conducive political environment to do that. So let me stop there.
Okay, let me, if I may, just respond and then, not respond, but just turn this into a conversation. So, 2 points. First, you are probably aware that your successor at NASSCOM, Debjani, has graciously volunteered to be a distinguished fellow, and we've set up a so-called frontier technology hub as a way, I don't minimize, as it were, both the boldness and the magnitude of what's involved, as a way of reaching out to a set of communities that are not necessarily communities that we are linked with. But I wanted to, revert to, your time as a civil servant, to seek your reflections on the following. So I returned from the World Bank to NCR in 2001, and it was my impression that while we had an IT community that had successfully benefited from Y2K, they were very leery and snooty about working with government because they thought it was hard, that bureaucratic, etc., and returns are probably. And my sense is that that culture changed once TCS was asked to support Passport Saver. I don't know who it was or in government at that time. So that was, 20 years ago. My question at the moment is, what is your assessment? What's the assessment of people in the room about the comfort of the technology community in working with government in the kinds of development areas that you've mentioned? Could I get your response to that?
Yeah, I think that is certainly an area of concern, and I think the examples that you mentioned I was very closely associated with them when I was a civil servant. In fact, even before the Passport Saver project, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, MCA 21 as it was then called, was actually the precursor. And it was the first occasion on which the government actually worked with the industry to implement it, as opposed to the old model of by the government, for the government, using their own resources. And over a period of time, I think that model has been used in other places, but the experience of the industry has not been great. And a lot of them complained a lot about not getting paid, a problem which I had to face at the other side when I went to NASSCOM. But notwithstanding, I think things have changed because of big game-changing projects like Aadhaar, UPI, and so on, as well as, the traditional industry in India has been largely focused on external markets. That's a known fact. IT. But today we have evolved. But today there's a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and companies which are focused on India alone. They're not even focused on overseas. Their number one and their final goal is India. And I think we have to think of ways in which they can come in. And my belief is they don't have to work with the government. The government has to create space in which they can do their work and achieve this result. It's a question of aligning the ducks. Where the DPI plays that role of integration, we had a fascinating discussion on innovation and DPIs and what is the role of DPI in innovation. We also had another fascinating discussion, and I was fortunate to be a part of both, on the role of the state in DPIs. And I think that if, one thinks about it, the conditions do allow us to find solutions, and I believe that there are enough players within the industry, as I mentioned, straddling both the large established companies as well as some of the more innovative entrepreneurial companies. And if I may add, perhaps some of the innovative entrepreneurial companies may be more proactive and more useful in delivering the transformation that we are talking about.
Okay, well, I don't want this to be a bilateral dialogue, but therefore, what, did you want to come in at this point? So the question is, what does it mean for a NITI Aayog to nurture an ecosystem? These are all, buzzwords. But when when the rubber hits the road, we're talking about now an ecosystem. Have we succeeded because of intelligent policy? Have we succeeded because of luck? And is research the way to, in a sense, distill the lessons of the past? As I say, Debjani is helping us probe this on a empirical way, but as a as an economist, I'd like a bit more theory behind it. So, anybody want to respond to this? Go ahead.
So I do think that the reason why we are here today is partly because at least I represent the Gates Foundation, and I've also been involved in the journey in India in many different roles. Is that we do believe that there is a need for research to sort of interrogate what's happened, why it's worked, and so that when other countries take these approaches or these products that have been built here, there's a much more deeper understanding of how they can benefit from it, because those lessons have not been told, they've not been interrogated enough because of a lack of data. And so part of it today is to get this research community to start that conversation and maybe lead up to much more research being published, which would then help everyone understand why it's working the way it is, and then take it abroad. Or even in India, make sure that these policy changes become irreversible, because I do think that when bureaucrats change, policies do change, and having that understanding inside the country of why these things have worked and how we can use them better to achieve the policy objectives, I think would be very valuable. And so to that extent, the reason why we're here today is exactly that. The second thing I want to point out is, I think there's been a change in the software industry. I think you alluded to India being the focus. I think some of it comes from being the IT sector being a services-oriented play, versus now we're seeing a product play and also targeting the Indian consumer. And so it's a consumer play as well, so it's a very different industry today than it was 2001. And so from that perspective, it's great to see that maturity that has then led to a lot of change. And DPI has been a part of that journey as well, but I don't want to say that's the only reason why it's there.
I think we're almost out of time. I allowed one question to my former colleague. Look, the suspicion of the big players and their predatory behavior, and, if you will, the appropriate doctrines of competition that can reconcile innovation with predation is not easy. How much of an issue is that for India at the moment? And is it that we could, kill the goose, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as part of nurturing an ecosystem while curbing its abuses? Any thoughts or lessons?
So coming back to why we are here, why were DPIs, what role do they play in this ecosystem? So let us not forget, we talk about efficiency, we talk about productivity as economists. Let's not forget DPI was also an industrial policy response to combat the hegemony of a handful of big tech players. The idea, Nandan was one of our keynote speakers at the Competition Commission of India when we did a startup workshop. And he explained it that there are two routes to a technology future. A technology future which is dependent on a handful of companies, multinational companies, because for whatever reasons our innovations, Sanjay also pointed out, were frugal innovations, innovations in service process delivery, not so much in products, etc., etc. So we were not able to create the Googles and the Amazons of the world. Having said that, so DPI then therefore wanted to democratize technology by bringing in public goods and digital public rails for private players to build on. And we have sufficient innovative capacity, capability amongst our startups to build on these building blocks and digital public infrastructures, and therefore to create more innovations and the white spaces of innovation which was being discussed. Now, but we have to also see how this DPI ecosystem is developing, because regulatory responses or regulation will not be sufficient. First of all, there needs to be an integrated regulatory response. We cannot have a fragmented regulatory response with data protection, competition law, non-personal data protection issues, etc. Because all these issues will start emerging in the DPI ecosystem as well. So we don't want to be in a situation where we commit the follies of the past, where again this DPI ecosystem is captured by a handful of companies. So we need to make sure that the relationship between our startups and these handful of companies is on a fair level playing field, and there are rules in place, and especially rules in place when it comes to data. And that's why data is the most important product which would be coming out as a consequence of these DPI transactions, which need not again be captured by a handful of companies. The regulation will not be enough. We need to put in certain, so competition law and rules, so we need to put in certain governance rules in the public-private partnerships which are emerging. So we have that model, the model concession agreements, so of infrastructures, where the infrastructure provider had to do certain things so as to make competition and viability of those infrastructures and cause further follow-on innovation. So those are some areas which we should now start thinking, that how to contract these public-private relationships such that these private entities, there's no, again, decentralization by these handful big tech companies. The other area where this would require, because when you were talking about AI, I did some work on AI also, the huge amount of innovative capability for the startups, in the startups. So again, the industrial policy response to unleash that capability would not be just to leave it to the market and let the startups and the big tech interact with each other, because there is still dependencies when it comes to AI applications, be it GPUs, be it data sets, etc. So again, that's where the DPI response or the DPI industrial response comes, which is far more powerful than just pure regulatory instruments.
Okay, again, I want the liberty of making one final point, and then Jael, you take it over. And in another context, this was more in the area of human capital and health issues in particular for emerging markets. We struggled for a definition of what is an emerging market, and certainly the definition that I found interesting or useful was two characteristics. One is sufficient sophistication and capacity to solve your own problems, okay? And I think India has that now. But second, and I think that's really what's in the room at the moment, to innovate in ways that are disruptive globally. And I suspect it's the latter that is going to be most under challenge in the new kind of global environment. And as we, transition to a much more transactional kind of system of interstate relations, the question of, whether we are allowed to put up, as it were, barriers or put up controls on overseas players, and in turn, if in third markets we are allowed to project disruptive technologies, I think that's a whole additional area of thought and research. But you've been very generous. You were meant to be chairing this, and you've given me more than my airtime. So thank you for organizing this.
So I'm basically what's standing between everyone in this room and cocktails or whatever, whatever you're going to do with the rest of your day. I want to thank Kapil and Suman for being here. It's a joy to have you here. I want to thank Sanjay for devoting his Saturday, a huge opportunity cost. We wouldn't have been able to do this without your presence, and thank you so much. Co-Develop, obviously, our partners in crime in this conference today. I'd like to also thank, obviously, all of the participants, and especially those here who stayed till the bitter end. They started at 9 o'clock this morning, and there's still people in this room, so that means that we must have done something right today. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the GDN team. In particular, you've been in contact with Balu, and especially Saurabh here, who's been a staccanovistic in his dedication to this conference. And for those of you who will happen to be in Europe in the fall, we have our annual conference this year is in Clermont-Ferrand. Clermont-Ferrand is if you put your finger in the map of France, it's the Barycenter, the geometric Barycenter. It's about 350 kilometers south of Paris. It's about 400 kilometers from everywhere, from Geneva, from Marseille, from Bordeaux, from everywhere. It's a tire town. It's Michelin. That's where we're having our annual conference this year for historical reasons. The theme is all things digital and development. So it's not DPI per se. Nandan will be there to give a keynote. I think so. It's between October 28th and October 30th. We'll send some propaganda material on the. And so then stay tuned for more propaganda material with what we'll set up. Roger will set up with the various research questions. And I hope. To quote Humphrey Bogart in the last line in Casablanca, this is just the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and we continue to interact, and we manage to actually construct. It's up to us. I can promise that I will do my damnedest to keep this moving forward, and we construct, again, I hate the term, but it's the consecrated term, a community of practice where people interact on a regular basis, and let's go out and proselytize about this and get some damn good research done. And that's it. Now, real mic drop.